Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Futurum Tech Webcast. Today, we're going to talk about contact tracing apps and what those apps mean for privacy in the era of COVID-19. Before we get started, this is a reminder that in this webcast, we might talk about publicly traded companies. We might express opinions because we have many of them. But note this show is intended for informational purposes only. Please do not use anything we say as investment advice or guidance. That is not what we intend here. With that aside, I'm joined today by my colleague Olivier Blanchard, and today we're going to talk about, as I said, contact tracing apps and what that means for privacy. Are privacy and security concerns taking a back seat when it comes to combating the COVID-19 pandemic? Olivier, you've written a ton about this in recent weeks. So tell us what's going on out there.
Yeah, it looks like I'm going to be writing a ton more about it too, because so the tech world, which has been criticized for not having jumped fast enough on COVID-19 and coronavirus response, actually kind of has in at least one domain, and that is contact tracing. And there's one thing that technology companies, especially in this era of ubiquitous connectivity and apps and everybody carrying a smartphone, tech companies have an ability to kind of reinvent contact tracing, make it much more democratized, much faster, and allow us to kind of, map out areas where the virus might be spreading, who might be touched by it, et cetera. Especially when we know that this virus is mostly affects people, but they remain asymptomatic, which means they present no symptoms for a very long time, if ever. So sometimes being in contact with someone who's positive for the virus but shows no symptoms can lure people into thinking that they haven't been in contact with the virus when in fact they have. So a lot of companies are trying to build apps and systems that will allow individuals to be notified if they've come in contact with someone who's tested positive recently, and will also help public health systems track the spread of the virus one way or another. And one of the main efforts that I've been tracking that seems very promising is a collaboration between Apple and Google. And one of the reasons for that is Apple is behind iOS, which is the operating systems for iPhones. And then Google, of course, is behind Android, which is the operating system for most of the other phones. And so by combining their resources and their research on this one platform, what they're able to do is create a contact tracing platform that will be compatible for iPhones and all Android phones as well, which is really important. And so they've put together this plan to put together an app that's going to be released in phases. And essentially what the app does is it uses Bluetooth on your phone. And essentially when you come within, say, 5 or 6 feet of somebody else's phone, or your phone rather comes within 5 or 6 feet of somebody else's phone, a Bluetooth ping or handshake happens that's encrypted, and the phones basically make a note of that proximity. Then later on, if one of you or people with phones test positive for the coronavirus, what they can do is have the app downloaded and enter their new status of COVID positive or coronavirus positive in the app, which is completely anonymized. It's all encrypted. And what will then happen is a third party will send a notification to all of the phones that your phone, as an infected person, has been near, to let them know that they have come in contact recently with somebody who has recently tested positive. The cool thing about this is that it's completely anonymous. The data is anonymized. So as the person being notified, you don't get a notification that you were near somebody who was infected, on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street on Tuesday at 3 p.m. It also doesn't tell you, hey, Joe Smith just tested positive. It just tells you that you've come near somebody who has tested positive, and therefore it implies that that you should probably be tested just to be sure because you were close to them. That's it. And if you're the person who has tested positive, your data is also anonymized and encrypted, which means that when you enter that information into the app, before it goes anywhere else, it basically hides who you are, hides your identity. So it does everything that it can to protect people's privacy and still provide individuals with the information that they need in order to stay safe and to prevent the spread of the virus without necessarily giving away any private information and private medical information about anyone to anyone else.
I think I read something, and I can't pull the data point completely out of my head, but I read something that criticized this initiative because it assumes that, I don't know if it was requiring phones that were a certain generation, like newer generation phones, if this is capability, that it won't be democratized in terms of people's efforts to be able to download and use that app. And that's just a tiny, tiny snippet of information in my brain. Am I remembering correctly that there are some concerns about that?
Oh, it's possible. I mean, it's not a perfect system, right? So,
yeah,
it's entirely possible that yes, if you use a clamshell phone from 2005, which you shouldn't be using anymore,
yeah,
it's possible that
I'll have to
older
do
phones
some research.
might be, yeah. But there are other concerns too. Yeah, it's not perfect. So on the one hand, people have to opt in, which in my opinion, most social media, most data tracking, most of anything that collects data on individuals should be opt-in. And I've been a big proponent of opt-in as a default since the beginning of apps. But in this particular case, I think that if it's opt-in and there's no sense of obligation, if there's no discipline among the general public, or some kind of incentive that's not just doing your civic duty and protecting yourself and your neighbors, but also an incentive like you can't go on Netflix and watch Tiger King
anything
unless anything ever unless you do this. So it's kind of like create a gateway around it, or penalize people by fining them or whatever, charging them with a misdemeanor if they refuse to comply, which would be very extreme. But unless you find some way of getting mass adoption and mass use of this type of app, I'm afraid that its effectiveness will be minimized, because if only 20% of the population uses it, that's not going to be an effective way of scaling contact tracing, unfortunately, and that's one of the conundrums here.
Yeah. Well, here in the U.S., we're not the only people who are the country who's struggling with trying to figure this out. And I wanted to take a minute and talk about what's going on in some other countries. And there are many more than we're going to talk about here. But in South Korea, for instance, they use contact tracing apps, and they also pull CCTV cameras, and they use credit card data to track movement and to also track people in quarantine.
Nice.
In Singapore, in Singapore, there was an app called Trace Together that was launched, and it's an opt-in model. And the amusing thing to me anyway is that they got something like 12% of the population to actually download and run the app. Okay. And what's interesting to me about that is that Singapore's in China, where everyone has to kind of at least pretend they like the government. And that aside, this wasn't a mandatory thing, and they only got 12% of the population to download it. So if that sort of shows you, what we might be able to expect. Taiwan, actually, I don't want to talk about Taiwan yet. I want to talk about China. In China, contact tracing apps are a given. And I spent some time in China in the last year or so, and it was so fascinating to me. Residents are just so used to every single thing they do being recorded. There's nothing that's secret. It's just their lives. And they're also used to using their mobile devices for everything. In China, contact tracing apps on your cell phone, they are mandatory. They're not asking for your participation. It's mandatory. And people are assigned a health code that's generated by your phone. That's your passport. You want to go to the grocery store? Show me your code. You want to book a train ticket? You better have a code. You want to go to a coffee shop? You better have a code. So nobody's trusting anybody. Everybody has their own little sort of thumbs up. You're able to go places. And lastly, I wanted to touch on what Taiwan is doing. And Taiwan has one of the lowest instances of the coronavirus, COVID-19. And they've been lauded all over the world about how they've handled this and how they've managed to keep their cases really low. And they engage in what's called participatory self-surveillance, which sounds like, oh, sure, right? Self-surveillance. They enforce quarantines with cell phone data tracking. They also use government databases that include travel and health records. So, I know where you've been. The government knows where you've been. But in addition to that, the whole country just opted in, and they voluntarily participated with the government to create what has been called like an online town hall, or a brainstorming site, or even a hacktivist sort of call to action. And what they did is they involved their citizens in helping to create solutions and or to providing feedback to different solutions that the government proposed. And so, for instance, somebody could be somewhere in the city and report that, oh, it looks like, chicken supplies are getting really low. And this database that citizens could continually contribute to. So part of the success that they had is that they didn't run into supply chain problems either, like we've seen in the United States, where people go crazy buying toilet paper or cleaning solutions or whatever. But they sort of were able to, but by involving citizens in this process, rather than just dictating policies to them, here's what you're going to do, like it or not, they have been able to create this atmosphere of trust and transparency. And truly, we've seen at this point, I forget the count. It's like 579 million, commercial spots that say we're all in this together from every brand on the universe. But what they did in Taiwan is they really created a situation where people believed that we are all truly in this together. And the only way out with a minimum loss of life is for us to pool our resources and our intelligence and our capabilities together and make this happen. And I cannot remember their death count, but it's ridiculous. I mean, it's like 400 people or something like that who they've lost to COVID-19. So that's kind of a big deal. I know you have a couple other countries that you've been looking at in terms of what else do you see out there?
Well, Europe's a pretty big factor, right? So we think, in terms of, we tend to be a little bit U.S. or North American centric, right? Just because that's where we live, and it's, the closer to threats, the more kind of like tunnel vision approach we have. But Europe's not that far away, and Europe's a really interesting case because you have, essentially sovereign states that all kind of tried to work together and adopt regional standards for the European community. And typically, especially after Brexit, you tend to look to Germany and sometimes France as kind of like the big central, like main economies in Europe to sort of decide where Europe is going to go or where it's trending. And so eyes are very often on Germany when new standards are being developed. And so Google and Apple, so to circle back to what I was talking about earlier, have done a really good job of convincing Europe that they have a really solid platform, and to try to bypass European efforts to create individual solutions for every country. So like Belgium would have its own solution, France would have its own solution, and that's fine. But they want to try to kind of centralize that a little bit. And Germany was a stumbling block for them. Germany, as of pretty much a week ago, backed a very centralized standard that they called Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
5 times fast,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. PEPPT, right? And what it would have done is, I think, if I remember correctly, it would have put all of the data in one central database. And then Apple, like other applications, would pull from that, as opposed to storing some of the information on individual phones, like I told you about earlier. And so Apple would not budge. Apple said, no, this is the way we're going to do it. If you want to do it this other way, you're not going to do it with us. And so, as crazy as it sounds, Apple's refusal to budge on this forced Germany to reverse course and accept a decentralized approach that uses phones to store some of the encrypted data as opposed to putting everything in one central place. So it's one of the rare cases where a technology company has influenced foreign policy, well, not foreign policy, but it influenced policy in another country, which could affect an entire region in terms of the adoption of this type of app. Now, simultaneously, Australia is doing something a little bit different. They've launched their own app called COVID Safe, and it's sort of the same thing. It's the same principle. You download the app and it picks up, some of your data, and it anonymizes your data so that when you do notify the app that you're positive, if you do, it doesn't know exactly who you are, and other people don't know who you are either. And in that case, again, there is currently no plan by the Australian government to make the use of the app mandatory. So far it's opt-in, right. As it is for pretty much all Western countries. At this point, so we'll see.
Now, I've
see
seen
what kind of adoption rates we get.
I've seen in news about that today that they released the app this weekend, and that it's been downloaded about 1 million times so far. And one of the things I thought that was interesting is that the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison was interviewed about this, and obviously, a lot of PR around this release. Yeah. And he said that, of course, downloading the app is voluntary, but he called it a civic duty. And, I think it's a really interesting concept. We're going to come back to that later in our discussion here about, how people perceive what their duty is as it relates to this right now. But it is really interesting to see what else is going on out there. Just to the U.S. in general, there are, what we're seeing in the United States, one of our problems, I think, in combating this is that every state is kind of its own entity doing whatever it wants to do. And in some ways that's good, in some ways not so good. North Dakota has launched an app, for instance, that uses, the app was originally developed for NDSU fans who were going to out-of-town football games, to be able to track, I'm on the road, Olivier, and you're on the road, and where are you? And, that sort of thing. So the app already existed. It was, by the way, developed by an NDSU alum. And that's an opt-in app. And I see that Utah just signed a contract, $2.75 million contract with an app company called 20 to build a voluntary tracking tool. And in Hawaii has talked about using GPS trackers to ensure that tourists on the islands are following quarantine instructions. So while I think sometimes our wild, wild west approach to things in the United States can be a good thing depending on what state you live in, it does seem to me that perhaps what we're looking at is a lot of different states spending millions and millions of dollars to kind of reinvent the wheel, instead of maybe us figuring out a solution on a nationwide basis that might not be such a bad idea and also might not cost us quite so much. Have you heard anything about any other states doing things like that?
It wouldn't surprise me if every state wanted to do their own thing. I don't know. Unfortunately, it's like the U.S. politically or culturally rather, is a little bit odd to me, because coming from France, right, being French originally, I grew up in a country that was just as nationalistic as the U.S., right? It's not as many flags flying everywhere, but the French are super proud of being French, and the French identity is very strong, just like the American identity is very strong. Like USA #1, right? And French are exactly the same way. Vive la France, right? However, in the U.S., there's also this weird kind of decentralized and sort of nationally decoupling mentality, where you're more part of a region or a kind of a cultural subset of the country, or even member of a state, than you are really truly an American. You're an American when it's time to fly the flag. You're not necessarily an American when it comes time to all rally together coast to coast, right? Like California and Texas and Nevada and New York. That's when you start getting into turf wars. It's like Clemson versus Carolina.
We don't like each other.
There's right. So everyone's trying to do their own thing, and everybody's well, not everybody, but a lot of people want to do their own thing out of pride, out of, just kind of cultural / political pressure. Also, distrust, right? Out of distrust of the federal government, quote unquote, distrust of Google or distrust of Apple or big tech. And so we have these kind of, cultural biases, this soup of cultural biases that inform our decisions and our preferences and our fears. And sometimes instead of all coming together and saying, okay, the pros here, the people who can do this the fastest and the best at scale are Google and Apple. Period, right? And if we did that and concentrated all of the resources that we need on building this and adopting it nationally, we could get there a lot faster. But instead, if everybody starts retreating into their own fiefdoms and saying, okay, I'm going to use this app over here because cousin Billy Bob and cousin Joe over here is working for that company and therefore I have an in, what you end up with is this multitude of apps that are going to be marginally effective, inconsistently effective across the country, and that will also take longer to develop, longer to adopt, and create more confusion in the market. And so when it's, when it's dating apps, variety is great. Competition is awesome. When it's an app that's designed to, as quickly as possible, scale as big and as fast as possible to help save lives and create a uniform notification platform for the entire country, if you just use a kind of a patchwork of apps to try to bridge that gap instead of one central app, it's going to take longer. It's not going to be as effective. It's going to be a cluster, And so I'm a little bit concerned that sometimes our need to be, our need for individualism gets in the way of being effective.
Well, and I think that personifies everything about the United States, our need for it is our need for individualism. Right. And, we also have, you talk about regions. We also have, so much cross-border. I live in the state of Missouri, and the state of Kansas is literally 4 blocks west of me, and so you have all kinds of cross-border stuff and everything else. So it's just really interesting. And like I said, that the Utah contract with $2.75 million, cities and states everywhere are really struggling right now. Their budgets are taking a huge hit. I cannot imagine going with the solution that requires a multi-million-dollar investment at this point in time, rather than looking at what can we do, how can we, and even if, and part of the problem that we have is, we have the Midwest and we have the Southerners and we have the Northerners and we have, these people hate these people and nobody trusts New Yorkers. And, it's just, I'm sure that happens in other parts of, in Europe. I'm sure there are predisposed hatreds and things like, rivalries and stuff like that. But it is frustrating that we're talking about lives here, people. We're talking about common sense and pooling our resources, and maybe if we all pay some and, we get things happening faster. One of the things, speaking of getting things happening faster, I believe that what's going on in the private sector is actually going to play a very big role here. And here's why. Many of the largest companies out there already engage in tracking. Okay? Keyboard tracking, sign-in tracking, using your, your ID card. My daughter works for a 7,000 person firm insurance company that happens to be headquartered here in Kansas City. And one of the things that they've done for years is they do health tracking. Okay, totally opt in and give the company all kinds of data about your level of physical fitness and other habits that you have. But my daughter happens to be a single mom, and I've talked to her about this. Do you worry about the privacy business? And my daughter's a single mom, and the benefit that is offered to them by way of a reduction in insurance costs is so significant that not opting in isn't an option. So that's just one example of tracing and tracking. But so companies have been tracking forever, but with the advent of work from home that the COVID-19 pandemic has spurred, all of a sudden companies who aren't used to having all of their employees working from home are freaking out, right? We want to be sure people are productive and that they're working and again, going back to my daughter, I know that she's required to log on to her email by such and such a time every day. She never misses that time. And other requirements in terms are in place in terms of keeping track of her. But what's happening in the private sector, we're seeing PwC is a gigantic company that's actually playing in this space. They have a solution. They have a part of their company that's called Connected Solutions. Okay, and in their Connected Solutions practice, they offer technology solutions that focus on productivity, things like monitoring keyboard use, all different kinds of things. Well, what they've added to this offering is a solution called, actually the original solution is called Check-In, probably something similar to what my daughter uses. What they have done now, they've got a new solution that's a tracing solution. And this solution uses Bluetooth and Wi-Fi anonymously to map how employees interact. And so if a person ends up infected, it's their responsibility to notify HR. And HR then goes into the app and traces everyone that a person has been in contact with. So today, when everybody's working from home, probably not a thing. But the way that PwC is marketing this and positioning this makes perfect sense. We all want to get back to whatever semblance of normal is, right? Well, the only way we can get back to normal and have people descending again en masse in office buildings and working together is to be able to track who's healthy and who's not, right? And so I think that this is really tremendously interesting, because I think what we're going to see is a ton of enterprise companies adopting this kind of technology. And I think that will help spur the adoption of this kind of contact tracing in large ways. And, it's kind of a no-brainer. Olivier, hey, would you like a job? Would you like to keep your job? Right. If you want to come back to the office, here's what we need you to do. It's not like, it's the same thing. Like, people might not have loved having to scan in or check in or whatever else to measure productivity, or may not like having keystrokes recorded or any other kind of cameras recording what they're doing. But the reality of it is, it becomes normal and everyday. Just like for people in China, it's normal and everyday to have everything on CCTV and all other kinds of surveillance things. So I do think in some ways what happens with the private sector spurring this, certainly at the large corporation level, I think certain parts of our population will become more accustomed to giving up that privacy, if you will. Right. That doesn't mean necessarily that if they had the choice that they would necessarily opt in.
Right. Well, it's temporary. It could be, long term, but it's still somewhat temporary. I don't think we're going to be necessarily dealing with coronavirus fears 3 years from now. It could be like a year and a half. Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. But at the same time, something I was thinking about last week, because up until now, we've put so much emphasis on looking to the government, whether it's federal government, state government, county government, to provide testing, right? But it makes a lot of sense for companies to kind of start taking over with that and using their own resources to provide testing for their employees, and essentially clear employees to come back to work, or little by little, 20% at a time, whatever it takes. You still need to rethink workspaces so that social distancing can be kind of effective inside a building, requiring wearing masks, things of that nature. So there's other elements to this, but as part of the return to work phase of this journey, I think it behooves companies, especially large ones that have more resources, to take over the testing themselves. So it makes perfect sense to me, and it's frankly it's a piece of the puzzle that hasn't gotten enough attention in the media in the last 3 weeks that should have. I hear very few conversations about companies doing testing, as opposed to testing being available for free, at down the street or on some popular street somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's largely because in most instances, nobody's working. You know what I'm saying? Nobody's going to Apple's office or to Google's office or any place else in
Some of the states are reopening, right?
To be tested.
Georgia,
Some of the
South
states
Carolina,
are reopening. So and reopening and it'll be very interesting to see what happens. It'll be very interesting. But no, I do agree, and I believe that just like companies will probably drive the adoption of some of these apps that are being developed by the private sector, I think companies will also say, you know, we need to get back to business as usual as quickly as possible. So here's what we're going to do, and put some of those solutions in place.
Yeah, I like the idea of the health or medical passport, where you're not necessarily wearing like a sticker, like I voted, right? But it's like I tested negative. That's fine. Well, it's the opposite, right? You're not putting you're not putting a positive sticker on people who tested positive. Just like if you tested negative, you have the sticker. If you haven't tested anything, then you know. So it's like reverse discrimination. It creates like an elite of uninfected, but at least temporarily. But I do like the passport idea because you choose to flash it when you want to enter a building. You're not walking around down the street, picking up your mail with a mask on, hopefully. Please wear your masks when you go outside in public places. But so it's you self-identify as opposed to being identified by, something that's on your person.
Well, I think that's a great comparison. And I think we've talked about this offline before, but, when you go out today, and you have to make a grocery store run or whatever, those of us who choose to wear masks are self-identifying. And in all of our communities, we are running into people who are very comfortable not wearing a mask and, showing the world that they're not wearing a mask. So it'd be really interesting to think about that sort of, that opting in and being able to, because again, a mask is my physical way that I can show that I'm opting in to caring about everyone else's health, right? So that's a really interesting concept. We have so much ahead of us on this front. It'll really be interesting to watch. It'll really, But I think to wrap up, I think that, transparency is really key. I think that when states and when the government can look at, what they did in Taiwan and why it worked so well, I think that, and corporations, when corporations can be trying to figure out solutions to get back to business as normal, and to look at, it's really all about trust. It's all about transparency. I think it's in many ways, it's about inviting feedback, inviting ideas, sometimes it's even if you're not going to use any of the ideas that people give, sometimes just asking for their input makes all the difference in how people embrace things. And I think that, being able to show people, what's in it for me, and compared to what's in it for these technology companies that want my information, and being able to sort of assuage their fears that, this is temporary, to your point. I think all those things will go a long way toward getting some forward movement. And bottom line, if we want to get back to normal, we need forward movement. So it'll definitely be something interesting to watch. I think.
I just want to reiterate also that this contact tracing, which contact tracing is a puzzle we need to solve because it's such an essential component of being able to function as a society. Because we can't just shelter in place for the next year and a half, right? So contact tracing is absolutely primordial. But anonymized contact tracing also means that it's not just the people being notified that they've been in contact with somebody who tested positive, who don't see who it is. In theory, if the contact tracing app is designed properly, and my understanding of the Google and Apple partnership is that Google and Apple will not see that information either. So they might be collecting some information on you, but it's not that. They're not collecting medical information on you. So that's just something to bear in mind.
From the web.
So there needs to be a gigantic, we'll just pretend we didn't hear that. There needs to be a gigantic marketing campaign, a PR campaign around this, so that can help communicate that.
As we're talking about privacy, my phone was listening to me and responded to a query that I didn't make. So that was fun. Yeah.
That's kind of timely, right? All right. Yeah. Well, that wraps up our show today. Olivier, thanks so much as always for hanging out here today, and for our audience, we appreciate you as well, and we'll see you next time.
There will be plenty of more tech topics and tech conversations right here on the Futurum Tech Podcast, FTP. Hit that subscribe button, join us, become part of our community. We would love to hear from you. Check us out, futurumresearch.com or Futurum Tech Podcast. Daniel Newman, Fred McClymans, Olivier Blanchard. We'll see you later.